Right. Good morning. Good morning. And bless you. My name is David Swift. If you weren't here at the opening before worship, we're here at Palmdale Vineyard, and this is our weekend service. And yes, I have a handheld mic because I'm not giving the message today. Our executive pastor, Michael Meramble, is going to give us the message. And I'm really looking forward to see what the Lord shared with Michael and what he's got to share with us. Just a couple announcements. I hope you guys had a very, very safe and sane 4th of July. I hope no one's caused anyone else any other pain or got fined way too much money for using fireworks you shouldn't have been on using anyways and keeping us all awake. But regardless, I hope you got some great time with your family and friends in an intimate setting that was safe for you all. God bless you. And also thank you everybody that turned out for the our fireworks booth. It was just a massive turnout and it's done so well. Just thank you guys, everyone that came in to volunteer, everyone that did security staying overnight, all the things. Stephanie Viduka, just bless you, honey. You did an amazing job. And everybody that came to support her, Chris Burgett, Kevin Frost, Byron. Oh, just the name go on and on and on. But bless you. And Stephanie, you just had an amazing team. And thank you guys. And thank you, Regina, and women's ministry, men's ministry. God bless you guys. It was just a great time. One other thing I want to say, or two other things. One is our youth are meeting on Thursdays again, so check that out. Thursdays at 6:30 in Suite J, and then we're also going to be within the next probably couple 3 weeks. I'm not given a firm date because we got to just work out some of the issues. We're going to be launching into our midweek services again here, in-person live services, and also we're going to be posting our protocols of what live service looks like, what you need to come with, what you can expect when you get here, and that's going to work for not only our midweeks, but once we get into a live service. Let's just keep that in prayer. I know it seems like we're moving in the wrong direction in that regard, but we just want to make sure that you know that we're trying to prepare ourselves so when that day happens, we're going to be able to move right into in-person services. But again, youth meets on Thursday at 6:30, and within the next 2 to 3 weeks, we'll be launching our midweek services here at 6:30. Okay, God bless you guys, and again, happy 4th of July. Michael, it's all yours.
Thank you, David. You know, I'll take you behind the scenes here a little bit because we're filming on Thursday because of the holiday weekend. So Pastor David still has his eyebrows right now, and he might have singed those off between today and through the 4th of July. So if you see him next week and he doesn't have eyebrows, that's because you know he was messing with too many fireworks. Although actually he kind of more feels like the type of person that would be turning people in and getting them citations and getting them in trouble in his neighborhood so he can go to bed at like 8 o'clock. That seems more like what he is, not the guy throwing fireworks at his face. But anyway, good to be with everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I really like the topic that I got this time around, and so it's something that I have thought about a lot and something that I've actually studied a little, and just I just like talking about it. So we're going to hop right in. We're in our series, Their Story is Our Story. And today we're going to be talking about the 12 disciples. We're going to kind of lump them in all in one group of all 12 of them. And I've titled today's message, The 12 Stumbling and Fumbling. Because the reality is that the 12 disciples don't necessarily do very much perfectly, if anything at all. They seem to stumble and fumble through their 3 years of ministry with Jesus. And even beyond that ministry, they tend to stumble and fumble. And so I think, at least for me, and I assume a lot of you will feel the same way, that following Jesus feels like something that you do a lot of stumbling and fumbling in. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from these guys. So I want to talk a little bit about who they are. A lot of people, for those of you that are maybe new to faith or just didn't know this in general, but a lot of people were following Jesus. It wasn't just like only these 12 were with him all the time. There was actually a lot of people that were with him all the time. Maybe 70, 100 people that were pretty much consistently following him where he would go, listening to him when he would teach. They kind of devoted their life to following him as much as they possibly could. What separates the 12, there's even more than that follow him kind of sporadically, into the thousands even, that follow him kind of consistently, but maybe don't leave their home for multiple days to follow him or for their lifetimes like the disciples do and others. But the disciples are these 12 hand-picked people. It's almost as if they didn't make the choice themselves because Jesus has called them into following him. And so that they are kind of distinct in that way, that Jesus is the one that really approached them rather than being attracted to Jesus through his messaging or through friends or family that told you about Jesus. The 12 are really called out by name by Jesus to come and follow him, and they do. And so that makes them a bit unique in that way. Also, the 12 disciples are these guys from different backgrounds, diverse backgrounds, different kind of political beliefs, different histories and stories and family life and all kinds of things. Some are brothers, some are friends, some are not connected to the others in any way. And so there's a lot of kind of diversity and interest among the 12 of why Jesus would choose them to be the 12 that he decides to bring. And so what we're going to look at, I'm going to look particularly at the Gospel of Mark. And so I want to talk a little bit about why Mark is different when we're talking about the 12 disciples versus maybe the other 3 Gospel writers. Mark himself was, best we know, probably a companion of Peter's, probably closest with Peter. He's not a disciple himself. And he was also maybe from time to time had some connection with Paul. We could guess from some of his writings, but for the most part, he would be a companion of Peter's. And he writes the 12 disciples in the book of Mark almost as a foil to Jesus, that Jesus is this model of perfection in the human form, and the 12 disciples are like written as the opposite of that. They're like what it would be like if Jesus wasn't fully God and fully man, that they do Christian faith and they walk out Christian faith and they walk out following Jesus the way that we do. And that is just falling to pieces all the time. And Mark writes them so honestly, he writes them so like genuinely in that way. And I think like Luke doesn't write them that way, and Luke probably doesn't write them that way because it's not really the point of what Luke is trying to do. Luke is trying to convince Romans about Jesus Christ. And Matthew doesn't write them that way because Matthew is really interested in kind of going back, looking at prophecy and pointing towards Jesus is the fulfillment of that prophecy. And so the 12 disciples don't really play a role in what Matthew is trying to get across to a Jewish reader. And John, when you read John, it really seems like John's main point is to make John look cool. I mean, outside of Jesus, John is kind of interested in John when he's talking about the disciples himself. He doesn't seem as interested in the other disciples. And when he puts them down, you kind of go, well, that's just John ripping one of his fellow 12 because he thinks he's cool and he thinks they're kind of all lame. And so that's kind of, when you read through John, it feels that way because he's always talking to himself about like, I'm the one that's loved by Jesus and whatever. So John writes them a little differently. But Mark is this book of the Bible that most scholars would assume is probably the first gospel that was written. It doesn't have a birth narrative about Jesus. It doesn't have a resurrection narrative about Jesus. It starts with Jesus doing ministry and ends with Jesus being put in a tomb. And really, that's the width that we get. And so it's almost fully kind of intentionally talking about Jesus' ministry with people, and people in particular being how his disciples followed him and what they did wrong when they followed him. And so Mark is this incredibly interesting book. I think it's one of my favorite books of the Bible just because it's so different in the way that it's written about people, in the way that he kind of delves into the relationship that Jesus has with his disciples, in the way that it knocks off the 2 most important things that we as Christians today would celebrate, Easter and Christmas. He doesn't even have them in his gospel. He just doesn't even have them. It's so interesting. He just focuses in on Jesus' relationship with the disciples and his ministry. And so I love Mark, and Mark is the perfect book to be. I'm going to use it several times in this message. We're going to read out of Mark because of the way that he kind of talks about the disciples. And I would encourage you, because I'm just not able to do all of it, but I would encourage you, if you have time, Mark is the shortest gospel. Take a couple days, read through Mark, and read through it with the intention of trying to think about the disciples and how they fail or succeed. Like kind of wipe everything else out of the way and read through Mark, especially if you've read through the Gospels multiple times. read through Mark and really try to find places where you're like, hey, the disciples look like they're not doing things right there. And just see how many times Mark kind of calls them out on those things. I think you'll be amazed. I think it'll be an interesting way to read through something, and you'll see it from a different angle. All right, so let's pop into our notes because I want to get us started in what we're going to be talking about. So in your notes, I wrote this. It says, as Christians today, there is a lot we can recognize and resemble in our personal up and down relationship with Jesus that is just like the 12 disciples. While we may want to hold them up as an unattainable standard, the truth is they are just like us. Their struggles and successes are directly related to the fact that, first of all, they said dumb things. They said dumb things. And you'll notice that my blanks kind of have a first blank and then a but. So we'll get to the buts after we do the first blank. But first, let's start with the fact that they said dumb things. I want to read a story out of Mark chapter 9. It starts in verse 30. It says, they left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. They came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, what were you guys arguing about on the road? But they kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, anyone who wants to be first must be very last and the servant of all. He took a little child whom he placed among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. Right here we see, like, this is kind of a famous story across the Gospels of Jesus kind of bringing children forward and making them out. And like you see it in internet memes, and you see it in Sunday school classes, like, let the children come to me. It's like all this children thing. But it's funny because actually in Mark, the reason why Jesus is doing that is because the disciples, Jesus is out there on a walk with them, teaching them, talking about how he's going to die. And instead of listening to Jesus about what he's talking about, what are the disciples doing? They're arguing with each other about which one of them is the greatest one. Like, this is their thing. Jesus is trying to get them on track of like, listen, guys, like, things are going to go down here. I'm going to die. This is not going to be the thing you think it's going to be. And instead of listening to him, they're like embarrassed because they weren't really listening to him. They were spending too much time arguing about which one of them was the greatest. They're constantly talking about dumb things that don't matter while Jesus is trying to instill them with truth. It happens over and over and over again in Mark. I think this is probably the biggest example of it, just because the severity of what Jesus is trying to express to them is, I'm going to die, and you think I'm going to be like, at best they think he's going to be raised up and be this conqueror, and he's telling them, no, I'm going to die, and they're not even hearing it because they're too busy trying to figure out which one of them Jesus likes the most, or which one of them is going to have the greatest position in Jesus's, grand conquering revolutionary army. Like, it's nuts. They're just so off of what they're supposed to be talking about. Right? Who is the greatest? They actually will have this argument about who is the greatest. It's recorded in every single gospel, but it's also, they'll have this argument more than once. They'll actually, like, Jesus kind of goes, all right, well, if that's the argument you're going to have, let me bring a child forward and say, you want to know who the greatest is? People like this child are the greatest, and people that would welcome this child are like welcoming God, and they would be the greatest. And yet they will continue, they will have this argument a second time. They will argue with each other about who is the greatest. In Luke, Jesus says, the greatest is the least. That's who the greatest is. And they'll go back and argue about which one of them is better. Like, they just don't get it. They say some of the dumbest things. Here's the second part of your blank, though. So let me read the first part again. Here it says, they said dumb things, but also considered a lot of hard questions. Yeah, they really went ahead and said a lot of, just read through Mark like I encourage you to do. They say all kinds of things where you're like, man, they were really missing the point there. But they also they consider a lot of hard questions. They don't just leave it there. They don't just leave it at who is the greatest. They'll continue to have this argument, but they'll also consider some of the most profound and difficult questions that can be asked of them. Look at what happens with Peter in Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8, verse 27, it says this: Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do you say I am?" Or who do people say I am? They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets. But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Like, it's not that things are starting to click for them. I don't know if you can relate to this, where you get told something over and over and over again, and you kind of like ignore it. I'm sure if you're a teenager, or if you have a teenager, you probably feel like this is happening to you daily. Like, I say it, and I say it, and I say it, and I say it, and they don't seem to do it. But somewhere in their mind, it's starting to click. And that's kind of what happens with the disciples. And then there's this pivotal moment in Mark chapter 8. We're halfway through the book of Mark. This happens in all the Gospels. You're halfway through, and Jesus asks this question of them in all four Gospels, I believe. Like, who do people say I am? Who do you say I am? And every time Peter will reply, "You're the Messiah." Like, I believe you're more than just some guy. I believe that you have more power. I believe that you are connected to God in a way other people aren't. I believe something about you is different, that you're going to come to our rescue in some way. You're going to bring our salvation in some way. And so Peter is starting to click that this is what's going on. This is a hugely profound moment for Peter. This moment right here, we're going to talk about Peter because, boy, talk about a guy that stumbles and fumbles like Peter. But this moment right here is such redemption for Peter for like a lot of the other things that he'll do before and after this moment, because he's recognizing that Jesus is something more than just some prophet. He's more than John the Baptist. He's more than Elijah. He's greater than. And this verse is actually the verse that like Catholics rest the Pope on. Because Jesus will say to him, "Well, Peter, you're the rock that I'm going to build my church on." And that's where they get the idea of the Pope, that Peter is the first Pope, and the line of popes comes from Peter because he's the head of the church in that way. Like, this verse has profound implications. This kind of recognition that, yeah, Peter will do and say a lot of dumb things, but he wrestles with some really tough questions and gets to the right answer. And people recognize that in Peter. But then watch. Not to like hammer the point that they do dumb things, but immediately after, this is the next verse, Mark 8, verse 31. This is what happens. He says, He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Peter, Jesus is saying, this is what's going to happen to me. Like, the verse that we read where Jesus predicts his death actually happens after this. So it's the second time he's talking about it where they're still not listening. This is the first time. Peter takes him aside after this first time, after Peter just realized he's the Messiah, just realized he's something greater, that he's connected to God in some way that cannot be explained by Peter. Peter will immediately, when Jesus is like, and that means that I'm going to have to die and people are going to reject me, Peter takes him aside and is like, you cannot say those things. Those things are awful. That is not true. That will never happen to you. Like, it's like, have you lost your mind, Peter? Like, you immediately go back into like, I know better than Jesus, right? And then what does Jesus do? In verse 33, he says, but when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan, he said. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Talk about stumbling and fumbling. Talk about like something that connects with me in my faith, that something so profound can happen, and a minute later, I can do the opposite of that thing. Paul will talk about that, like, I want to do this, and then instead I do that, right? We all relate to this, like, oh, I just had an epiphany. The epiphany sounds kind of hard, or I don't like the epiphany, so I'm just going to go do the thing that feels comfortable, or the thing that feels natural, the thing that I want to have happen, versus the thing that God is trying to do in me, right? That's Peter. That's the disciples. They say a lot of dumb things, But it's okay to say some dumb things as long as you're wrestling with and confronting those really difficult questions that come up. All right. I think there is a connection point to this point in particular in our society today. Because I think we have a lot of people right now, I've seen a lot of people, and some people that I would really not expect to be kind of self-examining or self-reflective. They kind of think they're the best, and that's the way they kind of live their life. And yet with all of kind of the racial tension and the racial inequality that is being kind of brought up, that is fomenting up into our culture and kind of, getting into everybody's life and getting into everybody's mind and causing people to reflect in ways that maybe they've never reflected before, or think about their role in something that they've never thought about before. Like, this is kind of what it is. You can say a lot of dumb things in a time like this. There's like this heightened sense of like, got you. You said something that was like, that wasn't right. It wasn't the right way you were supposed to say that, or you can't do that. And it kind of feels like you're getting attacked, but you're also like, I'm really trying here. I'm struggling with difficult questions, but I'm also saying dumb things while I'm struggling with the difficult questions. And like, this is where we model Jesus. We give people grace. We give people grace to go, yeah, you're going to say that, like, Jesus, I have to predict my death to you multiple times before you're actually going to catch on. But like, I hope that you're moving in that direction. I hope that you're moving in the direction that catches on to what's really happening, that catches on to like, I have room for you to experience life and to try to figure out what is the right direction. And I think that's a lot of what people are dealing with today. They're trying to figure out, particularly, people that are white, are going, what is it that I am being challenged with? And what is it that I need to change? And do I need to change anything? And what do I need to be doing differently? And all those questions are great. And I hope you say some dumb things in the middle of them. And we learn our lesson from saying dumb things. And we grow together. And we grow as a community. And we grow as a nation. And we try to do better all together. Because I think that's the only way that it works. It's clearly the only way that it works for Jesus and his disciples. And you got Jesus with you. And you still can't understand. Like, we have a lot of work to do as people in our own lives. But don't be afraid to say dumb things, but also don't be afraid to recognize that what you said might have been dumb, right? So that's what I wanted to say about that. All right. Secondly, while we may hold them up as an unattainable standard, the truth is they, the disciples, are just like us. Their struggles and successes are directly related to the fact that, secondly, they caved under pressure. They caved under pressure. Like, constantly caved under pressure. Peter, poor guy, I'm going to beat up on him all day today. Peter, let's read this verse about Peter, because this story blows my mind, okay? This one's out of Matthew. Matthew 4, 25 through 32. I only think Mark didn't include this, because Mark talks about this story, but doesn't include, this is the Peter walking on water. He doesn't include Peter walking on the water. And I think it's because they're buddies and he doesn't want to embarrass Peter more than he has to. It's my only guess why you don't include Peter walking on the water, because they're friends and it's like, really, you're going to put that one in there too? I do so many dumb things. Can you just leave that one out? So here we go. Matthew 14, 25 through 32. It says, shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake, like he does. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And when they climbed back into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. This story is bonkers. Like, let's take a minute to really reflect. Here we have Peter again, just getting hammered by Jesus, right? Like, we just read Jesus rebuking him and saying, get behind me, Satan. Now he's saying he doesn't have a lot of faith. But let's think about this moment a little bit. Peter has the courage to kind of say, hey, if that's you, let me go out there also. And Jesus is like, all right, come on out. Like, I can do that. I can do anything, right? And then Peter does it. He's walking on the water. He's he is walking on water. And not only water, but it's like windy and wavy and like crazy. I mean, I don't even know. It's like impossible to even understand what that looks like. I can understand what it looks like to walk on still water, but to walk on wave, I don't even understand what that means. But Peter is doing it. And you would think in that moment, you'd be like, nothing could give you more confidence and courage and like, I have victory in my faith. I walked on water and Jesus made it possible. And like, that's what I would think most of us would think, that like Jesus is with me and an amazing miracle has happened. How could I ever have doubt? Like, he's doing it. He's walking on the water. And yet he looks around, he realizes it's windy, he realizes there's waves, and he starts to sink. And he loses faith. In the middle of his victory with faith, he loses faith. It's crazy. You would think that would be impossible. You would think like, man, if I was around and Jesus was doing things, the faith that I had in that moment would be beyond anything I've ever had in my life. And it's one of Peter's lowest moments of faith is in the victory. It's crazy to me that that's happening. And so Pastor David and we were talking about this verse a couple weeks ago. And he said something like, and I believe him in this. He said like, if I found out that this was just all the Matrix, and I could jump in the air and start flying because there's nothing holding me back anymore. And it's like, none of this is real. It's all a computer program, and I have control over the program, and I can just jump and start flying. He was like, I would be jumping and flying. And I believe that David is the type of person that he could say, I'm going to just jump off the ground and start flying. And then I thought about it for me. I was like, yeah, that'd be awesome. And I thought, actually, I think if I jumped off the ground right now, and I got about 10 feet in the air, and I was flying, I think I'd probably be more like Peter, because I'm more of a nervous person, and I'm less likely to take leaps of faith. And I think I'd be 10 feet over the ground going, well, how does this end? Like, can this end at any moment? I still feel pain, right? Pain is real. I don't know. If I fall, am I going to break my legs? If I go any higher and fall, am I going to die? Why am I flying? My legs work fine. I'm just going to settle on back down, and I'm just going to walk. Who needs to fly? I don't need to go flying into an airplane. I don't need to go crashing into buildings. I don't need to fall out of the sky and kill myself. I'd get pretty nervous once I was up there. And I so related with Peter. Like, it doesn't really matter how much faith and courage and strength and Jesus is in front of you. There's scary things around you. And those scary things love to overtake. They love to overtake the victories. They love to overtake the faith. They're so easy to kind of get in your head and be like, this is a little frightening. And that's exactly what happens with Peter. Right? And so I feel for him. I feel for him more after that conversation with David than I ever had, because I always just thought this was crazy. How could he do that? Instead, I'm kind of going, yeah, he was afraid of the seas. I mean, they're afraid of the seas in ancient, times, in ancient Rome. They're afraid of what is in the sea, what the oceans can do to you, how quickly they can take you out. Like, it's not something they want to be walking on and risking their lives over, right? So it's really interesting that in the moment of victory, he has this failing. And it's constant with the disciples. They cave under the pressure. And they're under an immense amount of pressure. They don't even realize the amount of pressure they're under, but they cave under it, and they cave under it, and they cave under it. And Peter will do that, right? Peter will do it so many times. Peter will do it at the trial. He'll deny Jesus 3 times. He caves under the pressure, right? Peter will do it after you think he's kind of conquered all these things. He'll cave under the pressure and not sit down and eat with the Gentiles, and Paul has to rebuke him for it, because he's worried about the criticism he's going to get from his buddies. Like, he's constantly caving under the pressure. Well after Jesus has come, well after you think, well, that's the Peter that like kind of grew into himself. He hasn't yet. He's always caving under the pressure. But here's the second half, right? They caved under the pressure, but they never quit. They never quit. Peter, a guy that, that many failings in front of Jesus, you'd think, man, maybe you want to get a different, maybe you want to, make it the 11 disciples and you take a hike because you're not really doing a great job here. But no, he doesn't. He sticks it out to the very end when he himself will be crucified for Jesus. He never quits. He takes the failings, he takes the stumbling and bumblings and all the things that he does wrong. He learns from them, and he never, ever quits. Now, I want to make a point here that walking on the water, right? Like, it doesn't mean that Peter eventually is going to learn how to walk on the water. It's okay to be afraid of walking on the water. Like, that's not the point here. It's not like he never quit and he eventually conquered and he walked on the water. No, he's never going to walk on water again. Like, that doesn't happen again. But he never quits in his faith of Jesus. He never quits in understanding that Jesus has something better for him. He never quits in thinking like, my failure means that I can't move forward. He always and consistently moves forward. I wrote this down because I thought it was interesting as I was thinking about it, and I made a slide for it. It says, failing Jesus is a paradox. It should be a one-time thing that never stops happening. Let me lay it out again. Failing Jesus is a paradox. It should be a one-time thing. You should do it once, and you should be like, boy, I would never do that again. I just failed my Lord, my Savior. But it's also something that will always continue to happen. So you can't, it's this circular, cyclical, is that even a word, thing that it's like, I will never do it again, but I also know it will always happen. I will never do it again. I could never want to do that again, but I always know it's going to happen. Like, I'll never achieve perfection, but I'll always never stop trying. I'll always cave, but I'll never give up. Like, that is this paradox that we have, where it's like, they can't, how can they possibly exist with each other? And they can only exist because Jesus grants us so much grace, and so much mercy, and so much forgiveness, and so much. Like, that's the only reason why that paradox can exist and be the way it's supposed to be, because Jesus is with us. Thirdly, while we may want to hold them up as an unattainable standard, the truth is the disciples are just like us. Their struggles and successes are directly related to the fact that, lastly, God uses people. God uses people, which is incredible in its own right. I want to read, this is kind of a long one, so I'm going to read through it quickly, but it's Jesus feeding the 5,000 in Mark. Mark chapter 6, verse 30 is where we're going to start. We're going to go to 44. So it says, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. This is a remote place, they said, and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered, you give them something to eat. I love the way Mark writes Jesus. You give them something to eat, right? They said to him, that would take more than a half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? Like, look, okay. How many loaves do you have, he asked. Go and see. When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000. Jesus, a famous story, right? Jesus feeds the 5,000. But let's think about what the disciples did in that story, because we're talking about the 12, right? Jesus says, give them something to eat. They're nowhere near a store. They're nowhere near any. The disciples are like, dude, what do you mean? Like, A, it's a lot of people, and B, would we really want us to spend half a year's wages to bring some bread for these people? Like, they're not getting it at all. They're just thinking purely numbers and purely like, what does it mean for me? And it's not worth it for me to spend that money on these people when we can just send them home, like all these different things, right? And then, there's a fire truck going by. So then Jesus ends up being like, fine, what do we have? I'll make it work, right? Like, he does the work for them. But Jesus uses people. He has them distribute it. He has them realize afterwards they pick up 12 basketfuls. God is using people to make his point, whether they're stumbling into it or fumbling into it, right? The disciples are here performing a miracle and they don't even realize it. Jesus is just like, you guys don't get it, but here you go. You're going to get it at the end of this. You're going to understand how this works. I'm sure they're over there snickering like, oh yeah, we're going to feed. We have 5 loaves of bread. There's 5,000 dudes here, plus their families. Like, we're going to feed all these people? Like, yeah, right, that's never going to happen. And then it does, and they end up with more food at the end than they had at the beginning, and they suddenly realize, like, something big and major is happening here. Well, you'd think they'd realize that, except this is Mark chapter 6. Mark again writes in chapter 8 that Jesus feeds 4,000 people in a very similar way. I don't have a slide for this, but let me just read it for you. Jesus says in Mark chapter 8, this is 2 chapters later, he says, I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. His disciples answered, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? We're talking about days, weeks, a month, I don't know how long, 2 chapters in Mark later, same situation, and they don't even remember what happened the first time. And Jesus is like, are you kidding me? And Jesus asks, like, what do we have? And they have like 5 loaves of bread, and he separates it and gives it to all the people. They do it again. God uses people. But boy, do we really need a lot of work. Like, they saw a miracle happen, and they couldn't even remember and grasp in their mind that Jesus could maybe do it again. They're just like, what are we supposed to do, Jesus? There's no way to feed them. And Jesus is like, are you kidding me? Like, I've already done this one before. Literally, I've done this one before. Every story that we have covered in this series of Their Stories, Our Story is about God using people. In fact, I was really trying to rack my head around, I don't know that there's a story in the Bible where God isn't using people to enact whatever it is he's doing. God, I can't think, maybe it's happened, but there's not usually a time where God just makes an earthquake happen without somebody out there going, an earthquake is going to happen and God is the one that's going to send it. And he's using me to tell you. He always uses people. People are the only thing he uses, it seems like, when he's trying to make a point or do something or teach us something or convict us of something. That God is always using someone else to do that thing. People are his most important messengers. People are almost his only messengers, short of a donkey at one point. He uses people solely to perform the things that he is trying to do on earth. Almost always. That's why when there's some random earthquake and somebody's like, oh, it's God doing it, it's like, I think that might just be a random earthquake because usually he has somebody out there screaming, there's an earthquake coming from God. He uses people all the time to do those things. And by God doing that, it's not a limitation of his power. It's not God being like, I can't do it unless people do it for me. But it's an invitation for people to discover what is God's power and how does it move through us? How does it change our ability to do things? God wants us to be brought up, to be made more powerful, to be strengthened, to be encouraged. That's why he uses people to do these things. He's constantly working on us. He's constantly using us. But there's always a but, right? God uses people, but this is the last point. That means we have work to do. It's awesome that God uses people, but he expects something from us in return. He expects us to take what he's trying to do and actually move forward with it. That's the hardest part. That's the part that we kind of drop the ball a lot on. That God is constantly saying, I want to use you for great and powerful things, and we're kind of going, that sounds okay, but what does this mean for me? What's going to happen to me if I do this? God's awesome. God, I believe in God. He's got the best in mind for me, but you're saying that now I have to do something in return? This is how it goes in Matthew chapter 3. We talked about this just minutely, I think, last week when Pastor David was talking about John the Baptist. But Matthew chapter 3, starting in verse 7, it says this. This is about John the Baptist. But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to where he was baptizing, he said to them, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Produce fruit in keeping with repentance, and do not think you can say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our father.' I tell you that out of these stones God can raise up children for Abraham. The axe is already at the root of the trees, and every tree that does not produce good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire." I love that, because what they're banking on is the fact that, like, we're the line of Abraham. That's what matters. That's what gives us power. And John the Baptist is like, if God wanted to, he could make these rocks children of Abraham. Like, being children of Abraham is not the point here. Being children of God is the point here. Producing good things. You guys are producing bad things. God doesn't just use people. God wants you to work with him in the way he wants to use people. It's not good enough to just be like, I'm a person of God. I'm a Christian. So that gives me the right now. Suddenly I have the power now. No, you have to do the work. You have to produce good fruit. You have to produce fruit first, and then that fruit has to be good. And what does John the Baptist say? And those of you that aren't, there's already the axe at the root of that tree. That tree can get cut down so fast, you'd be surprised how quickly that tree, the tree of, I can just name myself a Christian and suddenly it's all fixed, it's all done. Like, Christianity is the solution now. Like, I've put this, like, mask over my face, where, like, I'm Christian now, right? It's like, no, it's what's behind the mask that matters. The mask doesn't mean anything. You can put a mask on a rock. Like, it's about who you are. It's about what you do. It's about how you follow Jesus. It's about how you let God use you. He uses us, but requires our work to do it. And we see that in everyone that we've encountered, right? Being used to bring plagues and destruction, being used to carry a child that you've waited for very patiently, right? Being used to father a great nation, or in David's case, to lead one. Being used to prepare the way for Jesus. Both Mary and John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus. Like, they entered into the work that had to be done, all those people. They weren't just naming themselves as, like, people that God was using. They were doing the thing that God asked them to do. And I always wonder, like, were there other people? I mean, God knew, so I'm assuming there's not. But, like, have you ever thought, like, were there other Marys out there? And the angel came down and was like, hey, you want to do this thing? And they were like, no, that doesn't sound good to me at all. And Mary was the one with the open heart, right? Like, God needs you to participate in the things that he's trying to use you for. It's not just good enough to be like, God is using me. You have to actually do the work that God is trying to do in and through you. God doesn't just happen to you. God happens through you. Sometimes it's not even for your benefit. A lot of times it's not even for your benefit. You're going to do hard work for God and get nothing out of it yourself in this life. You're just going to do hard work for God. And maybe some of it will feel refreshing, but most of it's going to feel hard. It's going to feel rough. It's going to feel tough. But that's the work that he's asking you to do. And sometimes it's not even about you, and that's a really important thing to be thinking about. So, as I end here, if I had to synthesize, like, a takeaway for, like, the disciples, their story is our story, the disciples, right, the 12, it would be this. Not that it's okay to fail. I'm not saying that it's okay to fail, but that it's necessary to change. You will fail, but we're not like going, well, I'm content with that because I have to, because it's part of that paradox that I'm going to fail. It's about going, no, I failed, but I definitely want to do that change bit afterwards. I got to hop over to the other side where I'll probably fail again, but I'm not going to be okay with it. I'm going to change. And that cycle should be something that moves forward like a wheel, right? Yeah, I'm going to fail, but I'm going to change. And you're moving in a direction that the 12 obviously do, because all 12 of them will die. Will die for Jesus in some way. Even Judas will die for Jesus in some way. Like, they'll die for this thing. And their wheel took a lot to get there, and they had Jesus standing in the flesh next to them. We don't have that, but we have a lot of knowledge about what it looks like. And I'm always just amazed that we get to stand back and go, wow, thank goodness for all the things that they did wrong, so that I can glean from it and start ahead of the game than they did. So with that, let me pray. Lord, we are so grateful. God, I'm grateful for your word. I'm grateful for the Bible. I'm grateful for the fact that smart guys wrote down things and you were a part of that transcription of events in a way that leads to us here 2,000 years later, where we can read it and learn from it and talk about it and have stories to discuss and realize that all these people are so much more like us than maybe we ever imagined, that there's so much more to them, that there's so much depth to their story, that they relate to us in such unique and interesting ways, and that there's so much we can learn from them. And so, God, I'm just grateful for the history that we have in that, for the amount of work that's gone into studying and researching and knowing about these things by really smart people smarter than any of us here. And so, Lord, I'm grateful that your plan in that has been working for thousands of years. And God, I just pray over everyone as we're stumbling and fumbling through faith, through life, through pandemics and tension and all the issues that we're facing in our daily lives, God. I just pray that we would find time to be near to you, that we would find time to know what it is you're trying to do through us, what it is you're trying to achieve out of us, who it is that you're trying to change through our lives and in our lives, God. I just pray that we would spend some time going, you know what, their story is my story, and my story is someone else's story. And would you connect me with somebody where I can connect in that way, or I can connect in a way that is so significant, that's so on the same level that I can pour into somebody. And God, let the reverse be true. If you are somebody out there that needs somebody to pour into you, may you find that person. May you find that person whose story is like your story, who can speak wisdom and truth and the hard truth and do the hard work with you to help you get where you are trying to go, where God is trying to take you. So, Lord, we are grateful for you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, everyone. I hope you had a great 4th of July, and we will see you again next time.